What happens when a desperate father's act of kindness collides with a billionaire's darkest secret? Tonight, we're diving into a story that will challenge everything you believe about family power and the lengths we'll go to protect the ones we love. A single moment of compassion in a storm-torn night will ignite a chain of events that threatens to destroy lives or transform them forever. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible journey, and please comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels around the world. This is a tale that begins with a lost child and ends with truths that will shake you to your core. The rain hammered against the cracked windows of Michael Carter's garage like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of another unpaid bill, another sleepless night, another prayer that tomorrow might be different. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows across the concrete floor, where oil stains told stories of countless broken-down dreams and fleeting hopes. Michael wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag that had seen better decades. His calloused fingers trembling slightly, not from the cold that seeped through every crack in the building, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that came from working 18-hour days just to keep the lights on. At 34, he looked older, worn down by the relentless grind of single parenthood and a business that seemed to bleed money faster than he could earn it. "Dad, when's Mom coming back?" The question hit him like a wrench to the gut, just as it did every time his 8-year-old son, Danny, asked it. Michael turned from the rusted Honda he'd been pretending to fix and looked into those innocent brown eyes that mirrored his own eyes, that still held hope despite everything they'd witnessed. "I don't know, buddy." Michael said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. He knew exactly when Danny's mother was coming back. Never. Sarah had made that crystal clear when she'd walked out 6 months ago, leaving nothing but a note about finding herself and needing space to breathe. As if their small apartment had been suffocating her. As if their son had been a burden too heavy to bear. Danny nodded with the kind of mature acceptance that broke Michael's heart daily. At 8 years old, his son had already learned that sometimes adults didn't keep their promises, that sometimes love wasn't enough, that sometimes the people who were supposed to stay forever just left. "Can we have mac and cheese again tonight?" Danny asked, already knowing they couldn't afford anything else. "You bet, champ. Extra cheese just like you like it." The smile that spread across Danny's face was worth every sacrifice Michael had made. In that moment, surrounded by the detritus of other people's broken-down vehicles, he felt something he rarely allowed himself to experience anymore, a flicker of contentment. They had each other. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The storm outside intensified, rattling the garage door with each gust of wind. The weather forecast had called it the worst storm to hit Havenport in decades, with winds strong enough to knock down power lines and rain heavy enough to flood the coastal roads. Most people had the sense to stay indoors, to hunker down with their families, and wait for it to pass. Michael should have closed the garage hours ago, should have taken Danny home to their cramped apartment above Mrs. Henderson's bakery. But the Henderson family had been good to them, letting them stay rent-free in exchange for Michael fixing their delivery van whenever it broke down. And lately, it had been breaking down a lot. Tonight was supposed to be the night he finally got it running properly again. "Dad, look." Danny's voice cut through the storm's roar, filled with an urgency that made Michael's protective instincts surge. He followed his son's pointing finger toward the garage's side window, squinting through the rain-streaked glass. At first he saw nothing but the blurred outline of the storm-battered street. Then, like a ghost materializing from the darkness, he saw her. A little girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, stumbling through the rain in nothing but a thin pink dress that clung to her tiny frame like a second skin. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, and even from a distance, Michael could see that she was shivering uncontrollably. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, already moving toward the door. "Dad, you said a bad word?" Danny pointed out, but his voice was small, worried. "Sometimes grown-ups say bad words when they're scared, buddy. And right now I'm very scared for that little girl." Michael yanked open the garage door, not caring that the rain immediately began soaking his work clothes. The wind nearly knocked him backward, but he pushed through it, calling out over the storm's fury. "Hey, little girl, over here." She turned toward his voice, and Michael's heart nearly stopped. Her face was a mask of terror, her eyes wide and unfocused, with the kind of shock he'd seen in war veterans, in accident survivors, in people who'd witnessed things no one should ever have to see. Tears mixed with rainwater on her cheeks, and her lips were turning blue from the cold. "It's okay, sweetheart," Michael called, extending his hand toward her. "You're safe now. Come inside where it's warm." The girl hesitated, her survival instincts warring with her desperate need for shelter. Michael could see the exact moment when exhaustion won out over fear. Her small legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees on the rain-slicked pavement. Michael didn't think. He ran. In seconds, he had scooped her up into his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile. She was barely more than skin and bones, and her skin was ice-cold to the touch. She didn't resist his embrace. Instead, she curled into his warmth like a kitten seeking shelter. "I've got you," he whispered, carrying her quickly back to the garage. "You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." Danny was waiting by the door, his eyes wide with concern. "Is she okay, Dad?" "She will be," Michael said, though he wasn't entirely sure. The girl was conscious but unresponsive, her eyes staring at nothing. Danny grabbed that emergency blanket from the first aid kit, the silver one. As his son scrambled to help Michael gently set the girl down on the cleanest chair he could find. She was shivering so violently that the chair rattled against the concrete floor. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Michael asked, his voice soft and patient. When she didn't respond, he tried again. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl's lips moved, but no sound came out. Michael leaned closer and finally heard the whisper, "Sophie." "Sophie? That's a beautiful name. I'm Michael, and this is my son, Danny. We're going to take care of you, okay?" Danny returned with the emergency blanket, and Michael wrapped it around Sophie's tiny shoulders. The metallic material crinkled as he tucked it around her, and slowly the violent shivering began to subside. "Danny, can you get some of that hot chocolate mix from my thermos, the one in my truck?" "On it, Dad." As Danny ran off on his mission, Michael knelt down in front of Sophie, studying her face. Even through the trauma and exhaustion, he could see that she was a beautiful child, dark hair, olive skin, delicate features that spoke of good genetics, and probably a comfortable upbringing. Her dress, despite being soaked and torn, was clearly expensive. This wasn't a street kid or a runaway from a broken home. This was someone's precious daughter, someone's whole world, which raised the terrifying question, where were her parents? "Sophie, can you tell me what happened? How did you get out here in the storm?" The girl's eyes focused on him for the first time, and Michael saw intelligence there, awareness fighting its way through the fog of shock. "Bad men," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "They took me from Mama. I ran away, but I got lost." Michael's blood ran cold. Kidnapping. The word echoed in his mind like a death knell. This innocent child had been abducted, and somehow she'd managed to escape. But if there were bad men looking for her, then she wasn't safe yet. None of them were. "Sophie, these bad men, are they still looking for you?" She nodded, her eyes filling with fresh tears. They have big cars and guns. They said they were taking me to see Grandpa, but Mama said never to go with Grandpa. She said he was... It's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to explain. You're safe here. But even as Michael said the words, he knew they might not be true. If professional kidnappers were involved, it was only a matter of time before they tracked Sophie down. They'd have resources, connections, technology. All Michael had was an aging garage in a forgotten part of Havenport, and a fierce determination to protect this child. Danny returned with the hot chocolate, his face serious beyond his years. Here, Dad. I made it extra sweet. Michael helped Sophie hold the thermos cup, guiding it to her lips. She took small, tentative sips, and he watched as some color returned to her cheeks. The simple act of drinking something warm seemed to ground her, bringing her back from whatever nightmare she'd been reliving. "Thank you," she whispered, and Michael's heart clenched at the genuine gratitude in her voice. "You don't need to thank us, Sophie. This is what people do. We help each other. Mama says not everyone is nice. She says some people pretend to be nice, but they're really bad. Your mama sounds very smart, but some people really are nice and they help because it's the right thing to do." Sophie considered this, her dark eyes studying Michael's face as if trying to read his soul. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her because she relaxed slightly in the chair. "I want to go home," she said, and the simple statement carried the weight of the world. "I know you do, sweetheart, and we're going to help you get there. But first we need to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me your last name or your mama's phone number?" Sophie shook her head. "Mama said never to tell strangers our real names. She said it wasn't safe." Michael exchanged a glance with Danny, who was listening to everything with the focused attention of a child trying to understand the adult world. The fact that Sophie's mother had coached her on not revealing personal information suggested they'd been living under some kind of threat for a while. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was part of something bigger, more dangerous. "Okay, we don't need to worry about that right now," Michael said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "The most important thing is keeping you warm and safe." He stood up, his mind racing through possibilities. He should call the police, of course. That was the logical, legal thing to do, but something in Sophie's story made him hesitate. She'd mentioned that the kidnappers wanted to take her to see her grandfather, and that her mother had specifically warned her against this grandfather. Family kidnappings were often the most complicated, involving custody battles and legal gray areas that could take months to sort out. And in the meantime, Sophie could end up right back in the hands of the people she'd risked everything to escape. "Dad." Danny's voice was small, uncertain. "What are we going to do?" It was the question Michael had been asking himself. The smart thing would be to call the authorities and let them handle it. The safe thing would be to distance himself and Danny from whatever danger Sophie represented. The legal thing would be to follow proper procedures and trust the system to protect an innocent child. But Michael had learned the hard way that the systems didn't always work the way it was supposed to. He'd learned that sometimes the people in charge made mistakes, that sometimes the innocent got lost in bureaucratic shuffle, that sometimes the only person you could really trust to do the right thing was yourself. "We're going to help her," he said finally, the decision settling into his bones like an old familiar weight. "We're going to keep her safe until we can figure out how to get her home to her mama." "Even if it's dangerous?" Danny asked. Michael looked at his son, brave, intelligent, compassionate Danny, and felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. He was about to involve his child in something that could go very wrong very quickly. But he was also teaching him something invaluable, that sometimes you had to stand up for what was right, even when it was scary. "Especially because it's dangerous," Michael said. When someone needs help, really needs help, you don't walk away just because it might be hard for you. You do what's right. Danny nodded solemnly, and Michael could see his own moral code taking root in his son's developing conscience. It was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse with wind gusts that made the entire building shake. But inside the garage, wrapped in the emergency blanket, and surrounded by the smell of motor oil and honest work, Sophie was finally beginning to look like a normal little girl instead of a traumatized refugee. "Are you hungry, Sophie?" Michael asked. "We don't have much, but we've got some crackers and juice boxes." "Yes, please," she said, her voice stronger now. "I haven't eaten since before the bad men came." Michael's jaw tightened. "When was that, sweetheart?" "Yesterday, I think. Or maybe the day before. It's hard to remember." 24 to 48 hours. Sophie had been missing for at least a full day, possibly longer. Her mother was probably going out of her mind with worry, assuming she was still alive and free to worry. The thought that something might have happened to Sophie's mother made Michael's stomach clench with dread. Danny had already retrieved the emergency snacks from Michael's truck, displaying the kind of initiative that made his father proud. As Sophie nibbled on crackers and sipped apple juice, some of the haunted look began to fade from her eyes. "My mama makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches," she said suddenly, the comment coming out of nowhere but carrying a lifetime of love and longing. "Tell me about your mama," Michael said, settling into a chair nearby. "What's she like?" Sophie's face lit up for the first time since they'd found her. "She's beautiful and smart, and she reads me stories every night. She works a lot, but when she comes home, she always has time for me. She says I'm her most important job. She sounds wonderful. She is. She's the best mama in the whole world, and she's probably really scared right now because she doesn't know where I am." The simple truth of that statement hit Michael like a physical blow. Somewhere out there, a mother was living through every parent's worst nightmare, not knowing if her child was alive or dead, safe or suffering. He thought about how he'd felt the few times Danny had been late coming home from school, the panic that rose in his throat, until he saw his son's familiar figure walking up the street. To have that panic stretched out over days with no resolution, no answers, it would be enough to drive someone insane. "We're going to find a way to let her know you're safe," Michael promised. "I don't know how yet, but we will." "You promise?" The weight of that question settled on Michael's shoulders like a lead blanket. He was making a promise he might not be able to keep, raising hopes that could be crushed, involving himself in a situation that was already far beyond his capabilities. But looking into Sophie's trusting eyes, he knew he had no choice. "I promise." The garage door rattled violently as another gust of wind slammed into it, and all three of them jumped. The sound reminded Michael that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm they might be walking into. Somewhere out there, bad men with big cars and guns were looking for Sophie. And when they found her, they weren't going to be deterred by a struggling mechanic and his 8-year-old son. "Dad," Danny said, his voice tight with worry, "what if those bad men come here?" It was the question Michael had been trying not to think about. His garage wasn't a fortress. The locks were old, the windows were large, and there were too many ways in for determined individuals with resources. If Sophie's kidnappers tracked her here, Michael and Danny would be sitting ducks. "Then we'll be ready for them," Michael said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. "How?" Michael looked around the garage, taking inventory. He had tools that could serve as weapons, a back exit that led into the alley, and a truck that could get them out of there quickly if necessary. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We'll make a plan," he said, "and we'll be smart about it." As if summoned by his words, the sound of car engines rumbled through the storm. Michael's blood froze as he realized the engines were slowing down, pulling into the parking lot outside. Sophie must have heard them too because she was suddenly rigid with terror, the color draining from her face. "They found me," she whispered, and the despair in her voice made Michael's heart break. "Maybe it's just someone else," Danny suggested hopefully, but even he didn't sound convinced. Michael moved to the window and carefully peered through the rain-streaked glass. 3 black SUVs had pulled into the parking lot, their windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. They were arranged in a formation that suggested military or law enforcement training, positioned to block the most obvious escape routes. "Sophie," Michael said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. We're going to play a game, okay? It's called hide and seek. And you're really good at hiding, aren't you?" She nodded, understanding immediately that this wasn't really a game. Danny helped Sophie get into the storage room, all the way in the back behind the boxes of old parts. "And both of you stay absolutely quiet no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me?" "What about you, Dad?" Danny asked, his voice small but brave. "I'm going to talk to these people, find out what they want. If everything's okay, I'll come get you in a few minutes. If it's not okay..." Michael paused, hating that he was having to say these words to his child. "If something happens to me, Danny, I need you to take Sophie and go out the back door. Mrs. Henderson has a spare key to her car under the flower pot by her back door. Take Sophie to the police station, tell them everything, and don't trust anyone who says they're here to help unless they're wearing a police uniform. Understand?" Danny's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded. "I understand, Dad." "Good boy. Now go, both of you. And remember, no matter what you hear, stay hidden until I come get you or until it's safe to leave." Michael watched as Danny took Sophie's hand and led her toward the storage room. Despite everything, he felt a surge of pride at his son's courage. 8 years old and already braver than most adults Michael knew. The car doors were slamming now, and Michael could see shadowy figures moving through the rain. He had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the garage door. 30 seconds to come up with a plan that would keep 2 innocent children safe. He grabbed a tire iron from his workbench, not much of a weapon against guns, but better than nothing. Then he moved to the main garage door and waited. The knock, when it came, was professional and authoritative. The kind of knock that expected to be answered immediately. "We're closed," Michael called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Come back tomorrow." "Sir, we need to speak with you. This is a matter of extreme urgency." The voice was cultured, educated, with just a hint of an accent Michael couldn't place. Not what he'd expected from kidnappers, but somehow that made it more frightening rather than less. "Like I said, we're closed. Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested. Mr. Carter, we know you're in there. We also know you have something that belongs to us. Open the door, and we can discuss this like civilized people." They knew his name. Of course they did. These weren't random criminals, they were professionals with resources and connections. They'd probably known everything about him within minutes of Sophie being spotted in the area. Michael's grip tightened on the tire iron. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Mr. Carter, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. We're not here to hurt you or your son. We simply want to retrieve the child and return her to her family." "What child?" There was a pause, and Michael could hear muffled voices conferring outside. Then the cultured voice returned, and this time there was an edge to it. "Mr. Carter, we have reason to believe that a missing child sought shelter in your establishment. This child is the subject of a family emergency, and her grandfather is very concerned about her welfare. We're here on his behalf to ensure her safe return." The grandfather. Sophie had mentioned that the kidnappers wanted to take her to her grandfather, and that her mother had warned her against him. This confirmed Michael's suspicion that this was some kind of custody battle taken to extremes. Even if there was a child here, which there isn't, I wouldn't hand her over to strangers, Michael said. If you're legitimate, call the police. Let them handle it. Another pause longer this time. When the voice returned, the pretense of civility was gone. Mr. Carter, I'm going to give you one last opportunity to cooperate. Open this door and turn over the child, or we'll be forced to take more direct action. You have 10 seconds to decide. Michael's mind raced. He could try to stall hope that someone would notice the suspicious activity and call the police. But this was an industrial area mostly deserted at night, and the storm would keep any potential witnesses indoors. He could try to fight, but he was one man with a tire iron against multiple professionals with unknown weapons. Or he could run, but the back exit led to an alley that was probably already being watched. 10. Michael moved away from the door toward the storage room where Danny and Sophie were hiding. 9. He had to get the children out of here. Everything else was secondary to that. 8. There had to be a way. There was always a way if you were smart enough, brave enough, desperate enough. 7. The skylight. The garage had an old skylight that opened onto the roof. It was small, but Danny and Sophie could fit through it. From there, they could make their way to the adjacent building, and 6. Michael was already moving, grabbing a ladder from the wall and positioning it under the skylight. 5. He yanked open the storage room door. Danny and Sophie were huddled behind a stack of transmission parts, their eyes wide with terror. Change of plans, Michael whispered urgently. We're going up. 4. Michael lifted Sophie onto his shoulders, feeling how light she was, how fragile. Danny scrambled up the ladder beside them. 3. The skylight was rusted shut. Michael pushed against it with one hand, while balancing Sophie with the other, his muscles straining against decades of neglect and weather damage. 2. The skylight gave way with a screech of protesting metal. Rain immediately began pouring through the opening, but Michael had never been so happy to feel water on his face. 1. Michael lifted Sophie through the opening, then helped Danny climb out onto the roof. The storm was even more intense up there, with wind that threatened to knock them off their feet and rain that stung like ice. But they were out. They were free. The sound of the garage door being forced open echoed from below, followed by shouting voices and the beam of powerful flashlights. "Dad!" Danny called over the wind. "Go!" Michael shouted back. "Get to Mrs. Henderson's. Take care of Sophie. I'm not leaving you." Michael's heart broke and swelled with pride at the same time. His son was brave, loyal, everything a father could hope for. But that loyalty could get them all killed. "Danny, I need you to be the man now. I need you to protect Sophie. Can you do that for me?" Danny looked at Sophie, then back at his father. Michael could see the exact moment when his son understood what was being asked of him, not just to run, but to take responsibility for another person's life. "I can do it, Dad. But you have to promise to come find us." "I promise, buddy. Now go." Michael watched as his 8-year-old son took a 6-year-old girl by the hand and led her across the rain-slicked roof toward the adjacent building. They moved carefully, but quickly, 2 small figures against the storm-dark sky, carrying between them a courage that most adults would never possess. Below, he could hear the sounds of his garage being torn apart. Voices shouting orders, furniture being overturned, boxes being opened and dumped. They were looking for Sophie, and when they didn't find her, they were going to come looking for him. Michael made his way back to the skylight, knowing he had to buy the children more time. If he could lead the searchers away from this area, Danny and Sophie might have a chance to escape. He dropped back into the garage and immediately found himself face to face with three men in expensive suits that somehow looked pristine despite the storm. They moved with the fluid efficiency of professionals, and Michael didn't doubt that they were armed. "Where is she?" The cultured voice belonged to a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes. "Where's who?" The backhand came without warning, snapping Michael's head to the side and filling his mouth with the taste of blood. He'd been hit harder in his life, but never by someone wearing rings that cut like knives. "Mr. Carter, please don't insult our intelligence. We know the child was here. We can see the evidence, the emergency blanket, the hot chocolate, the crackers. Where did you take her?" Michael wiped blood from his lip and met the man's eyes steadily. "Even if there was a child here, you think I'd hand her over to thugs who break into private property and assault people?" Another hit harder this time. Michael's vision blurred, but he stayed on his feet. "The child's name is Sophia Sinclair," the man said, circling Michael like a shark. "She is the granddaughter of Howard Sinclair, one of the most powerful men in this country. She was taken from her lawful guardian and is currently being held against her will. We are here to return her to her family." Sinclair. The name hit Michael like a thunderbolt. Even someone like him who didn't follow politics or business news knew that name. Howard Sinclair was a billionaire industrialist with connections throughout the government and military. If this was his granddaughter, then Michael wasn't just dealing with kidnappers, he was going up against one of the most powerful men in America. "Lawful guardian," Michael repeated. "Where's her mother?" The man's eyes flickered with something that might have been annoyance. "Ms. Sinclair is indisposed at the moment. Mr. Sinclair is acting in the child's best interests." Indisposed. The euphemism sent a chill down Michael's spine. In the world of powerful men like Howard Sinclair, indisposed could mean anything from hospitalized to imprisoned to dead. "You're not cops," Michael said. "You're not social workers. You're just hired muscle working for a man who's trying to steal a little girl from her mother." The third man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight Russian accent. "Where are they?" Michael looked him in the eye and smiled through his split lip. "Go to hell." The punch to his stomach doubled him over, driving all the air from his lungs. As he gasped for breath, strong hands grabbed his arms and hauled him upright. "Mr. Carter," the silver-haired man said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "You seem to be under the impression that you have choices in this matter. Let me clarify your situation. Howard Sinclair wants his granddaughter returned safely. We will find her with or without your cooperation. The only question is whether you and your son will be alive when we do." The mention of Danny made Michael's blood run cold. "My son has nothing to do with this." "Your son is with the girl. That makes him very much a part of this. Now where did you send them?" Michael's mind raced. How much did they know? Had they seen Danny and Sophie on the roof, or were they just assuming they were together? If there was any chance the children had gotten away clean, he couldn't give these men anything that might help them track the kids down. "I don't know what you're talking about." This time the blow came from behind, something hard and heavy crashing into his kidneys. Michael collapsed to his knees, while waves of pain radiating through his lower back. "Mr. Carter, this is your last warning. Tell us where they went or we start breaking things. And we don't stop with your fingers." Michael struggled back to his feet, using every ounce of willpower to keep his voice steady. "You can do whatever you want to me. I'm not helping you hurt children." The silver-haired man studied him for a long moment, then nodded to his companions. "Search the neighborhood. Check every building, every car, every hiding place within 6 blocks of here. And remember, Mr. Sinclair wants the girl returned unharmed. The boy is expendable. Michael's vision went red. He lunged forward, forgetting about the pain, forgetting about the odds, thinking only of protecting his son. His fist connected with the silver-haired man's jaw with a satisfying crack. Before he could follow up, something hard crashed into the back of his skull. As consciousness faded, the last thing Michael heard was the sound of car engines starting up, spreading out into the storm-dark streets to hunt for two innocent children who were probably cold scared and alone somewhere in the night. And in that moment, as darkness claimed him, Michael made a promise to himself and to them. If he survived this, if he lived through whatever these men had planned for him, he would find Danny and Sophie. He would keep them safe, and he would make sure that Howard Sinclair learned what happened when someone threatened Michael Carter's family. The storm raged on outside, but inside the garage, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and the wreckage of his simple life, Michael Carter began the most important fight of his life. The rain drummed against the hospital windows like fingertips tapping impatiently on glass, each drop a reminder of time slipping away. Isabella Sinclair opened her eyes to a world of white walls, white sheets, white bandages wrapped around her head like a crown of pain. The antiseptic smell burned her nostrils, mixing with the metallic taste of blood that lingered in her mouth. "Miss Sinclair, can you hear me?" The voice belonged to a woman in scrubs, her face kind but professionally distant. Isabella tried to speak, but her throat felt like sandpaper. She managed a weak nod instead. "Good. I'm Dr. Martinez. You've been in an accident. Do you remember what happened?" Accident. The word echoed in Isabella's mind, triggering fragments of memory that flashed like broken glass in sunlight. A car spinning out of control, the screech of tires on wet asphalt, the sickening crunch of metal against tree bark. And before that, Sophie. Isabella whispered the name torn from her throat like a prayer. "Where's my daughter?" Dr. Martinez's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral in the way medical professionals mastered when delivering difficult news. "Ms. Sinclair, you need to rest. You have a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and... Where is my daughter?" Isabella's voice grew stronger, fueled by a mother's desperate need to know. She tried to sit up, ignoring the way the room spun around her like a carnival ride. "Ms. Sinclair, please. The police are handling..." "The police?" Isabella's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "What police? What happened to Sophie?" Dr. Martinez hesitated clearly, wishing she were anywhere else. "Your father is here. He's been waiting for you to wake up. Perhaps you should speak with him about..." "No." The word came out like a gunshot, sharp and final. "I don't want to see him. I want to see my daughter." "Isabella." The voice from the doorway made every muscle in Isabella's body tense. Howard Sinclair stood there in his perfectly tailored suit, looking like a man who owned the world and everyone in it. His silver hair was immaculate, despite the late hour, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He stepped into the room with the confidence of someone who expected doors to open for him, expected people to step aside, expected the universe itself to bend to his will. "Father," Isabella's voice carried 30 years of pain, disappointment, and carefully controlled rage. "I told them I didn't want to see you. Dr. Martinez, would you give us some privacy, please?" Howard's tone was polite, but there was steel underneath. The doctor looked between father and daughter, clearly sensing the tension, then quietly retreated. When they were alone, Howard moved closer to Isabella's bed. She could smell his expensive cologne, the same scent that had terrified her as a child whenever he'd summoned her to his study for one of his lessons about the proper behavior expected from a Sinclair. "Where is she?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Safe," Howard replied, settling into the visitor's chair as if he belonged there. "She's safe, Isabella. That's all that matters." "That's not an answer. Where is my daughter?" Howard studied her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes calculating. "You were in an accident, Isabella. A very serious accident. You could have been killed." The accident was no accident. The words came from somewhere deep in Isabella's memory, surfacing like a bubble rising through dark water. You arranged it. You had someone run us off the road." "That's the concussion talking, darling. You're confused, disoriented. It's perfectly normal after a head injury." But even as he spoke, Isabella could see the truth in his eyes. The slight tightening around the corners, the way his fingers drummed once against his knee, tells she'd learned to read as a child when recognizing her father's moods could mean the difference between praise and punishment. "You did this," she said, and with each word, more memories came flooding back. "We were leaving. Sophie and I were finally getting away from you, and you couldn't stand it. So you had us run off the road. Isabella, and now you have her." Isabella struggled to sit up again, her ribs screaming in protest. "You have my daughter, and you're going to try to turn her into another one of your perfect little soldiers, just like you tried to do with me." Howard's mask of concerned paternal affection slipped, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Sophie is a Sinclair. She has responsibilities, obligations. She needs proper guidance. She's 6 years old. I was younger than that when my father began my education. The Sinclair legacy doesn't build itself, Isabella. Someone has to prepare the next generation." Isabella remembered her own education, the endless lessons about power and control, the way Howard had systematically isolated her from anyone who might show her genuine affection, the cold manipulation that had shaped her into exactly what he wanted, a perfect reflection of Sinclair ambition. It had taken her years to break free from his programming. Years to remember how to feel genuine emotion, how to love without conditions or expectations. She would die before she let him do the same thing to Sophie. "She's not your project," Isabella said, her voice gaining strength. "She's my daughter, and I won't let you destroy her the way you destroyed Mita Sun." "Destroyed you?" Howard laughed, the sound as cold as winter wind. "Isabella, I made you into one of the most powerful women in the country. You have wealth, influence, connections most people can only dream of. How exactly is that destruction? Because I was never allowed to be happy. I was never allowed to just be. Everything was about the company, the family reputation, the grand Sinclair legacy. I never had a childhood father. I never had friends. I never had love that wasn't conditional on my performance. Sentiment is weakness, Isabella. I taught you that. You were wrong." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Love isn't weakness. It's the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile. And I love my daughter more than I've ever loved anything in my life. Howard's expression darkened. Your love has made her soft, weak. She cries at the slightest provocation. She's afraid of shadows. She lacks the steel necessary to carry on our family's work. She's 6, Isabella repeated, each word carefully enunciated. She's supposed to cry. She's supposed to be afraid sometimes. She's supposed to be a child. Childhood is a luxury the Sinclair family cannot afford. Isabella stared at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. Not as the powerful patriarch she'd spent 30 years trying to please or rebel against, but as what he truly was, a broken man who had never learned how to love anything except power. "Where is she, Father?" "Somewhere you'll never find her." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Isabella like a physical blow. "You can't do this. She's my daughter. The courts will do exactly what I tell them to do. I have legal custody of Sophie now granted on an emergency basis due to your instability." "What instability?" Howard pulled a folder from his briefcase, the papers inside rustling like dead leaves. "Your recent behavior has been erratic, Isabella. Paranoid. You've been telling people that your own father was plotting against you, that you needed to disappear with your daughter to keep her safe. Classic signs of a psychological breakdown." Isabella's blood ran cold as she recognized the trap that had been years in the making. Every precaution she'd taken, every attempt to protect Sophie from Howard's influence had been carefully documented and twisted into evidence of mental illness. "You planned this," she whispered. "All of it. You've been building a case against me. I've been protecting my granddaughter from an unstable mother who was becoming increasingly delusional. The medical records are quite clear. You've been suffering from severe paranoia and anxiety, possibly triggered by postpartum depression that was never properly treated. Those aren't medical records. Those are lies. They're signed by some of the most respected psychiatrists in the country, men who owe me considerable favors." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her father's power pressing down on her like a physical thing. He'd done this before she realized, this careful orchestration of events, this manipulation of facts and people to achieve his desired outcome. How many times had he destroyed someone who stood in his way? How many lives had he ruined with nothing more than a few phone calls and some strategically placed documents? "The accident," she said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "You arranged it to make me look unstable. A woman so mentally ill, she crashed her own car with her child inside." "The accident was unfortunate," Howard said smoothly. "But it did provide an opportunity to intervene before you hurt yourself or Sophie any further." "Where is she?" Isabella asked again, but this time her voice carried a different quality, not the desperate pleading of a concerned mother, but the cold determination of a woman who had finally stopped trying to be the daughter Howard wanted and decided to become the mother Sophie needed. "That's not your concern anymore." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, gathering her strength. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and sure. "You're wrong about one thing, Father." "What's that?" "You think you taught me to be weak. But what you actually taught me was how to survive in a world full of predators." Isabella met his eyes, and Howard saw something there that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. "You taught me how to think like you, how to plan like you, how to be just as ruthless as you when something I care about is threatened." "Isabella, I'm going to find my daughter," she continued, her voice gaining power with each word. "And when I do, I'm going to take her somewhere you'll never reach us. Somewhere your money and your connections and your carefully purchased favors won't matter." Howard stood up, smoothing his tie with hands that weren't quite steady. "You're in no condition to do anything except recover from your injuries. The doctors say you'll be here for at least a week. Then I'll recover quickly. Even if you could leave tomorrow, you have no resources. I've frozen all your accounts, revoked your credit cards, canceled your phone service. You have nothing, Isabella. No money, no transportation, no way to fight me." Isabella smiled, and the expression was so cold that Howard actually took a step backward. "You forget, Father. You taught me never to rely on anyone else. I've been preparing for this day for 6 years, ever since Sophie was born, and I realized what you'd try to do to her." What are you talking about? Hidden accounts, false identities, safe houses, everything I need to disappear completely. Isabella's smile widened. You're not the only one who can plan ahead. Howard's face went pale. You're bluffing. Tell me, Father, when was the last time you actually checked my real financial situation? Not the accounts you know about, but the ones I've been building in secret, the investments I've made under different names, the properties I've purchased through shell companies. Howard's jaw worked soundlessly, and Isabella knew she'd hit her mark. He'd been so confident in his control over her that he'd never considered she might be planning her own escape. Even if that's true, he said finally, you still don't know where Sophie is, and you never will. I'll find her. How I have resources you can't imagine. People in every government agency, every law enforcement department, I have something you don't, Isabella interrupted. What's that? I'm her mother. I know her better than anyone else in the world. I know how she thinks, what scares her, where she'd try to hide. Isabella's voice softened slightly, and I know she's brave enough and smart enough to try to escape if she gets the chance. Howard's confident mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been uncertainty. She's 6 years old, Isabella. Where could she possibly go? You'd be surprised what a determined child can accomplish. Remember, she's half Sinclair. She has that steel you're so fond of talking about. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. A nurse peered in, looking apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, but visiting hours are over. Howard looked at the nurse, then back at Isabella. We'll continue this conversation tomorrow. No, Isabella said quietly. We won't, because I won't be here tomorrow. The doctors can go to hell. Isabella was already reaching for the IV line in her arm. I'm checking myself out. You can't. You're in no condition. Watch me. Howard moved toward the bed, but Isabella's voice stopped him cold. Touch me and I'll scream this hospital down. I'll tell everyone who'll listen that the great Howard Sinclair beats women in hospital beds. You wouldn't dare. Try me. They stared at each other across the narrow hospital bed, 30 years of conflict and manipulation condensed into a single moment of pure will. Finally, Howard stepped back. This isn't over, Isabella. No, she agreed, pulling the IV from her arm and ignoring the nurse's protests. It's just beginning. After Howard left, Isabella endured 20 minutes of medical staff trying to convince her to stay, threats about insurance coverage and warnings about the dangers of leaving against medical advice. She signed every waiver they put in front of her, accepted the prescription for pain medication she had no intention of filling, and ignored the disapproving looks from everyone in scrubs. When she finally walked out of the hospital into the storm-lashed night, wearing nothing but a hospital gown and a thin robe, Isabella felt truly free for the first time in years. The rain soaked through the inadequate clothing within seconds, and her ribs screamed with every step, but she didn't care. Sophie was out there somewhere, and nothing else mattered. The first order of business was transportation. Isabella made her way to the hospital parking garage where expensive cars sat in neat rows like sleeping predators. Her father's driver would be waiting somewhere nearby, ready to follow her the moment she appeared. But Howard had taught her to always have a backup plan. Isabella found what she was looking for 3 levels down a maintenance area where the hospital's service vehicles were parked. She'd learned to hotwire cars during her rebellious teenage years, a skill that had horrified Howard when he'd discovered it. Now, as her fingers worked the wires beneath the dashboard of an old Ford van, she offered a silent thank you to her 16-year-old self. The engine coughed to life and Isabella allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before backing out of the parking space. She had transportation. Now she needed resources. The storage unit was located in a part of town Howard would never think to look, an industrial area where businesses asked no questions, and cash was the only currency that mattered. Isabella had been renting the unit for 3 years under the name Maria Gonzalez, a fictional identity complete with driver's license, social security number, and work history. Inside the unit, wrapped in waterproof containers, was everything she needed for a new life. Cash, false identification documents, weapons, and a detailed file on every one of Howard's business associates and potential allies. Isabella had spent years compiling information, following paper trails documenting the web of corruption and influence that kept her father in power. She also kept a file on Howard himself, every dirty deal, every bribed official, every skeleton in the vast closet of Sinclair Industries. Insurance, she'd called it. Protection against the day when her father's patience finally ran out, and he decided she was more liability than asset. That day had apparently arrived. Isabella changed into dry clothes, jeans, boots, a leather jacket that had been expensive enough to last. She strapped a knife to her ankle and tucked a small pistol into the waistband of her jeans. Howard had taught her to shoot when she was 12, another lesson in the Sinclair education. Be prepared for anything he'd said. Trust no one completely. Always have a way out. Sound advice from a man she now had to treat as her enemy. The rain was getting worse as Isabella drove through the empty streets of Havenport. The storm that had helped Sophie escape was now working against both of them, making search and rescue operations nearly impossible. But it also provided cover, making it harder for Howard's people to track Isabella's movements. She needed to think like Sophie. Where would a 6-year-old girl go in a strange city during a storm? Not far, certainly. Sophie was brave, but she wasn't stupid. She'd look for shelter, for help, for someone who seemed safe. Isabella pulled over under a streetlight and unfolded a map of the city. The hospital was here, which meant the accident had happened somewhere nearby. Sophie would have been taken from the crash site, but if she'd managed to escape, she wouldn't have gotten far before the storm hit. Isabella traced a circle on the map, marking the area where Sophie was most likely to have sought shelter. It included several residential neighborhoods, a small commercial district, and an industrial area with warehouses and auto repair shops. Isabella's pulse quickened. Sophie was fascinated by cars and trucks, always asking questions about how they worked. If she was looking for shelter, she might naturally gravitate toward a garage or mechanic's shop. Isabella started the van and headed toward the industrial district, hope and terror warring in her chest. She was close to Sophie, she could feel it. But she wasn't the only one looking. Somewhere in the storm-dark city, Howard's people were conducting their own search, and they had resources Isabella couldn't match. The first 3 auto shops she checked were locked up tight, showing no signs of recent activity. But the 4th one was different. Police cars surrounded the building, their red and blue lights painting the rain-slicked street in garish colors. Isabella parked a block away and approached on foot, staying in the shadows. Through the windows of the garage, she could see investigators photographing the scene, collecting evidence, documenting what looked like signs of a struggle. "Excuse me, miss, you can't be here." Isabella turned to find a police officer approaching, his hand resting casually on his weapon. "I'm sorry, I was just... This is a crime scene. I need you to move along." "What happened here?" The officer's expression softened slightly. "Home invasion, looks like. The owner was assaulted and his son is missing along with another child." Isabella's heart stopped. Another child? Little girl about 6 years old. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Isabella forced herself to remain calm. "No, I'm sorry. I was just curious about all the police cars." Well, curiosity can be dangerous this time of night. Best to head home where it's safe. Isabella nodded and walked back to the van, her mind racing. Sophie had been here. She'd found help, someone had protected her, and now that person was hurt, and his own child was missing. The guilt hit Isabella like a physical blow. An innocent family had been destroyed because they'd tried to help her daughter. But it also meant Sophie was still free, still running, still fighting. Isabella drove through the night, checking every motel, every diner, every place a desperate man might take two frightened children. The storm was beginning to weaken, but the rain still fell steadily, turning the city into a maze of reflected lights and shadow. At a 24-hour truck stop on the outskirts of town, Isabella finally found what she was looking for. The night manager, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, remembered seeing a man with two children earlier that evening. "Seemed real nervous," she said, refilling Isabella's coffee cup. "Kept looking over his shoulder like he expected trouble." The little girl was scared out of her mind, wouldn't let go of the boy's hand. "Where did they go?" "Bought some food, used the restroom, then headed north on Highway 7. That's all I know." North meant the mountains where the roads were winding and dangerous, but offered plenty of places to hide. Isabella thanked the woman and returned to the van, feeling closer to Sophie than she had since waking up in the hospital. But as she pulled back onto the highway, Isabella noticed headlights in her rearview mirror, black sedans that matched her speed perfectly, maintaining the same distance no matter how fast or slow she drove. Howard had found her. Isabella pressed harder on the accelerator, and the sedans responded immediately, closing the gap between them. She had maybe a 2-minute head start before they caught up, and the van wasn't built for high-speed chases. But it wasn't built for luxury either. Unlike the sedans behind her, the van could handle rough terrain. Isabella yanked the wheel hard to the right, leaving the highway for a dirt road that led into the hills. The van bounced and skidded on the muddy surface, but it kept moving. Behind her, she could see the sedans struggling with the conditions, their low-slung frames scraping against rocks and ruts. One of the sedans got stuck in a particularly deep puddle, but the other pressed on its driver, apparently willing to destroy his vehicle to complete his mission. Isabella drove deeper into the mountains, following roads that became trails that became barely passable tracks. The van's engine strained against the steep grades, but it held together, carrying her further from her pursuers and closer to her daughter. Finally, when the fuel gauge showed nearly empty and the engine was making concerning noises, Isabella found what she was looking for, an abandoned hunting cabin tucked into a grove of pine trees. She parked the van behind the building and killed the engine, listening to the sound of rain on the metal roof. She was alone in the mountains, with no transportation, no backup, and no clear plan. But she was free, and somewhere in these same mountains, Sophie was fighting her own battle for survival. Isabella checked her weapons, counted her cash, and prepared for what might be the most important hunt of her life. Her father had taught her to be ruthless when pursuing her goals. Now she would show him exactly how well she'd learned that lesson. The mountain air cut through Michael's lungs like shards of ice as consciousness slowly returned to him. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, and the metallic taste of blood coated his mouth. Through swollen eyes, he could make out the interior of what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, its concrete walls weeping moisture in the pre-dawn chill. "Good you're awake." The cultured voice belonged to the silver-haired man who had orchestrated the attack on his garage. Michael tried to move only to discover that his wrists were zip-tied to a metal chair. His ankles were similarly bound, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest from the beating he'd endured. "Where are my son and the girl?" Michael's voice came out as a rasp, his throat raw from hours of unconsciousness. "That's what we're here to discuss." The man pulled up another chair, sitting close enough that Michael could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the faint odor of cigarettes. "My name is Vincent Carlyle, Mr. Carter. I work for Howard Sinclair, and I have a very simple job: retrieve his granddaughter and ensure that anyone who interfered with that process understands the consequences of their actions." "I don't know where they are." Carlyle studied him with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "I believe you. In fact, I'm counting on it. You see, Mr. Carter, your son is remarkably resourceful for an 8-year-old. He managed to evade 3 teams of professional trackers for over 6 hours. Impressive, really." Michael's heart clenched at the thought of Danny out there in the storm, cold and frightened, trying to protect a little girl he barely knew. He's just a kid. He's a liability. And liabilities have a way of becoming problematic. Carlyle reached into his jacket and withdrew a satellite phone. "But here's the interesting thing about children, Mr. Carter. They're predictable. They seek comfort, familiarity, the illusion of safety. Your son will eventually try to contact you. Danny's smarter than that. Perhaps, but he's also 8 years old and terrified. Children make mistakes when they're scared." Carlyle held up the phone. "When he calls, you're going to convince him to bring the girl to a location of our choosing. You're going to tell him that everything is safe, that the bad men are gone, that he can come home." "I won't do it." Carlyle's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that." The torture that followed was methodical and professional. Carlyle's associates worked with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before, applying just enough pain to break down resistance without causing permanent damage. They started with pressure points, moved to minor cuts, then graduated to more creative methods that left no visible marks. Through it all, Michael held on to one thought: Danny and Sophie were free. Whatever happened to him, whatever these monsters did, the children had escaped. That knowledge gave him strength even as his body betrayed him with shudders of agony. "This is pointless," Michael gasped during a brief respite. "Even if I wanted to help you, I can't. I don't know where they went." "But you will," Carlyle replied calmly. "Because your son is going to call you. It's inevitable. And when he does, you're going to make the right choice." Meanwhile, 30 miles away in the mountains, Danny Carter was learning that being brave was a lot harder than it looked in movies. The abandoned cabin he'd found offered shelter from the rain, but its broken windows and rotting floorboards made it feel more like a trap than a refuge. Sophie huddled beside him on an old mattress they'd dragged away from the worst of the water damage, her small body shaking with cold and exhaustion. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "It's okay to be scared," Danny replied, trying to sound older than his 8 years. "My dad says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared." "Your dad sounds nice." "He is. He's the best dad in the whole world." Danny's voice cracked slightly. "And he's going to find us. I know he will." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at Danny's stomach like hunger. It had been hours since they'd escaped from the garage, hours of running through dark streets and climbing over fences and hiding from cars that might contain the bad men. His clothes were soaked through his sneakers, squelched with every step, and he was pretty sure he'd never been so tired in his entire life. "Danny," Sophie said suddenly, "what if the bad men hurt your dad?" The question hit Danny like a punch to the gut, because it was the same thing he'd been trying not to think about. The look in his father's eyes when he'd told them to run the sounds of violence from below as they'd climbed onto the roof. Danny knew his dad had stayed behind to protect them, and that probably meant he was in danger. "He'll be okay," Danny said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My dad's really tough." Sophie studied his face in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. Despite being 2 years younger, she had an unsettling ability to see through adult lies and childhood bravado. "You don't really believe that, do you?" Danny was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But I have to believe it, or I'll go crazy. My mama taught me that sometimes believing in something makes it more likely to happen," Sophie said. "Like wishing on stars, but stronger." "What do you mean?" "She said that if you really truly believe that someone you love is safe, then love creates a kind of protection around them. It sounds silly, but Mama's really smart about things like that." Danny considered this. It did sound silly, but he'd seen enough strange things in his 8 years to know that adults didn't have all the answers about how the world really worked. And right now, with his father missing and Sophie depending on him, that he was willing to try anything. "Okay," he said. "Let's both believe really hard that my dad is okay and that your mama is looking for you." They sat in silence for a while, concentrating with the fierce intensity that only children could muster. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the cabin, something that might have been hope began to take root. "Danny," Sophie said eventually, "I need to tell you something about the bad men." "What?" "They work for my grandpa. He's not a good person." Danny frowned. "I thought grandpas were supposed to be nice, like on TV. Most of them are. But mine is different. He wants to take me away from my mama and make me live with him, and Mama says he'll try to change me into someone I'm not supposed to be." "Why would he do that?" Sophie struggled to find words for concepts that were too adult for her young mind to fully grasp. "Mama says he thinks love makes people weak. So he wants to take away everyone I love so I'll be strong like him. But Mama says that's backwards, that love is what makes you really strong." Danny thought about his father, about the way Michael worked 18-hour days to keep them fed and housed, about the sacrifices he made without complaint, about the fierce protection he'd shown when the bad men had come for Sophie. "Your mama's right. Love does make you strong." "I miss her," Sophie whispered, tears starting to flow again. "I miss her so much, it hurts." Danny put his arm around her shoulders, the way he'd seen his father comfort people. "We're going to find her, and we're going to find my dad. But first we need to get somewhere safe." "Where?" It was a good question. Danny had been so focused on getting away from the garage that he hadn't really thought about where they should go. The police seemed like the obvious choice, but Sophie had been kidnapped by men who acted like they had official authority. How could an 8-year-old tell the difference between real police and fake ones? "My dad has a friend," Danny said slowly. "Her name is Mrs. Rodriguez, and she works at the diner downtown. She's always been nice to us, and Dad trusts her. Maybe we could—" The sound of car engines in the distance cut him off. Danny's blood turned to ice as he recognized the low rumble of expensive vehicles moving slowly up the mountain road. The bad men had found them. "We have to go," Danny whispered urgently. "Right now." Sophie was already moving, her survival instincts honed by days of running and hiding. They grabbed the few supplies they'd managed to scavenge: a flashlight with weak batteries, a half-empty water bottle, some crackers from a vending machine Danny had managed to break into, and headed for the cabin's back door. The cars were getting closer, their headlights sweeping across the trees like searchlights. Danny counted at least 3 vehicles, which meant more bad men than he and Sophie could possibly evade in a straight chase. "This way," Danny whispered, leading Sophie toward a creek that ran behind the cabin. The water was ice cold and moving fast from the storm runoff, but it would mask their scent and footprints. They waded into the creek, gasping as the freezing water soaked through their already wet clothes. Sophie lost her footing on the slippery rocks and would have been swept away if Danny hadn't grabbed her hand and pulled her back to her feet. "Stay close," he whispered, "and try not to splash." Behind them, they could hear voices shouting orders, the slam of car doors, the beam of flashlights beginning to probe the darkness around the cabin. The bad men were being systematic about their search, which meant it was only a matter of time before they thought to check the creek. Danny led Sophie downstream, fighting against the current and the numbing cold. His teeth were chattering so hard, he was afraid the bad men would hear them, and Sophie's lips were turning blue in the weak beam of his flashlight. "I can't," Sophie gasped, stumbling again. "I'm too cold." "You have to," Danny replied, but he could see that she was reaching the limits of her endurance. They needed shelter warmth, and they needed it soon, or hypothermia would finish what the kidnappers had started. That's when Danny saw it, a culvert running under the mountain road, where the creek passed beneath the asphalt. The concrete tunnel was barely big enough for an adult to crawl through, but it would provide cover from the wind and rain, and the bad men were unlikely to think of looking there. "In here," Danny whispered, guiding Sophie toward the tunnel entrance. They crawled into the culvert, the sound of rushing water echoing off the concrete walls. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but it was hidden. The residual heat from the sun-warmed road above provided a small measure of warmth. Sophie collapsed against Danny's side, her small body shivering uncontrollably. Danny wrapped his arms around her, sharing what little body heat he had left, and tried to think of what his father would do in this situation. "We need to get warm," he whispered, "and we need help. Who can we call?" Danny had been carrying his father's emergency cell phone, a beat-up flip phone that Michael had given him for situations exactly like this one. The battery was nearly dead, and the signal in the mountains was weak, but it was their only connection to the outside world. "Mrs. Rodriguez, bumped," Danny said, dialing the number he'd memorized years ago. "She'll know what to do." The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Rodriguez residence." "Mrs. Rodriguez, it's Danny. Danny Carter." "Danny Mijo, what's wrong? Where are you?" The kindness in her voice made Danny want to cry with relief. "I'm in the mountains with a little girl, and there are bad men chasing us. They hurt my dad, and I don't know what to do." There was a pause, and Danny could hear the sounds of Mrs. Rodriguez moving around, probably getting dressed. "Okay, Danny, listen to me very carefully. Are you somewhere safe right now?" "I think so. We're hiding in a tunnel under the road." "Good. Stay there. I'm going to call the police and then I'm going to come find you. Can you tell me exactly where you are?" Danny looked around the tunnel, trying to remember landmarks from their journey. "We're on the mountain road that goes to the old mining camps. There was a broken-down cabin, and we followed a creek down to where it goes under the road." "I know that area. Danny, I need you to promise me something. Don't move from where you are unless you absolutely have to. Don't trust anyone who isn't me or a police officer in uniform, okay?" "Okay." "And Danny, your father is a strong man. Whatever happened to him, he's going to be all right. You just focus on keeping yourself and that little girl safe." The call ended, and Danny felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. Help was coming. Real help from someone he trusted. Now they just had to stay hidden until Mrs. Rodriguez arrived. 60 miles away, Isabella was learning that desperation could be a more powerful motivator than any amount of money or influence. She'd abandoned the broken-down van hours ago and stolen a motorcycle from a parking lot, using skills she'd learned during a misspent youth that Howard had tried so hard to erase from his perfect daughter's history. The motorcycle handled the mountain roads better than any car could have, allowing her to take shortcuts and back trails that would have been impossible in a larger vehicle. but it also left her exposed to the elements. And after hours of riding through wind and rain, Isabella was soaked to the bone and fighting hypothermia. None of that mattered. Sophie was close. Isabella could feel it with the supernatural intuition that seemed to exist between mothers and children. Every mile brought her closer to her daughter, and she would have crawled through fire to cover the distance. The first sign that she was on the right track came when she spotted the black sedans parked alongside the mountain road. Isabella counted at least a dozen vehicles, their occupants obviously coordinating some kind of search operation. She parked the motorcycle behind a cluster of trees and approached on foot, moving with the stealth Howard had insisted she learn as part of her complete education. Through the trees, she could see men with flashlights and radios, their movements suggesting military or law enforcement training. They were searching systematically, dividing the area into grids and checking every possible hiding place. These weren't random thugs, these were professionals, and they were hunting her daughter like an animal. Isabella's hand moved instinctively to the pistol tucked into her waistband. She could probably take out 2 or 3 of them before they knew what hit them, but the odds were still hopeless. She needed a different approach. That's when she heard the voice. Target acquired. 2 children approximately half a mile downstream from the primary search area. Isabella's blood turned to ice. They'd found Sophie. The radio chatter continued, coordinates being exchanged, teams being repositioned. She had maybe 10 minutes before they closed in on her daughter's location. Isabella ran back to the motorcycle, her mind racing through possibilities. She couldn't fight them all, but she didn't need to. She just needed to create enough chaos to give Sophie and whoever was protecting her a chance to escape. The first sedan exploded when Isabella's improvised Molotov cocktail crashed through its windshield. The men scattered, shouting orders and reaching for weapons, but Isabella was already moving to her next target. The second explosion sent a fireball into the night sky, and suddenly, the organized search became a scene of confusion and panic. "Contact!" someone shouted. "We're under attack!" Isabella smiled grimly as she heard the sound of men running radios crackling with urgent communications, the careful search operation dissolving into chaos. She might not be able to save Sophie directly, but she could buy her daughter precious time to escape. The third explosion came from the gas tank of a pickup truck, and that's when Isabella knew she'd pushed her luck too far. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions, bullets whining off rocks and trees around her position. Isabella threw herself behind a boulder, feeling chips of stone pepper her face as bullets struck inches from her head. She was pinned down, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. But the diversionary attack had served its purpose. The men hunting Sophie had been forced to redeploy to deal with the new threat. "This is Carlisle," a familiar voice crackled over a dropped radio. "What's your status?" "We're under attack by an unknown assailant. Multiple casualties, vehicles destroyed. Requesting immediate backup. Maintain your positions. Do not repeat. Do not allow the targets to escape. We're moving to your location now." Isabella's heart sank. Carlisle was the man from the hospital, Howard's top enforcer. If he was personally involved in the search, then Sophie was in more danger than Isabella had realized. She needed to reach her daughter before Carlisle did. Back in the culvert, Danny heard the explosions echoing across the mountains like thunder. Sophie pressed closer to him, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Danny replied, but he was starting to hope. The bad men had been getting closer, their voices and flashlights moving systematically in their direction. Now there was confusion, shouting, the sound of vehicles racing away toward whatever was causing the explosions. "Danny," Sophie's voice was very small. "I think my mama might be out there." "What makes you say that?" "She told me once that if anyone ever tried to take me away from her, she'd burn the whole world down to get me back. And those explosions, They sound like burning. Danny considered this. It seemed impossible that a mother could single-handedly take on all those bad men, but then again, he'd learned that parents were capable of extraordinary things when their children were threatened. His own father had proven that by staying behind to face the kidnappers alone. If it is your mama, then we need to be ready to run when she creates an opening, Danny said. But Mrs. Rodriguez is coming to get us. We might not be able to wait that long. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the culvert. Danny's heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to determine whether the steps belonged to rescue or capture. Danny. The voice was familiar, warm, safe. Danny, are you in there? Mrs. Rodriguez. Danny nearly sobbed with relief. She crawled into the culvert, her face creased with worry and determination. Dios mío, you children are frozen solid. Come on, let's get you out of here. We can't, Danny said. The bad men are still out there. Not anymore, mijo. The police are here, and whatever was happening up the mountain has drawn all the bad men away. This is our chance. Mrs. Rodriguez helped them out of the culvert, wrapping them in warm blankets she'd brought from her car. The blessed relief of being dry and warm made both children want to weep with gratitude. Where's my dad? Danny asked, as Mrs. Rodriguez led them toward her vehicle. The police are looking for him, Danny. That's all I know right now. It wasn't the answer Danny wanted, but it was better than nothing. As they drove down the mountain toward safety, he looked back at the orange glow on the horizon where the explosions had occurred. Somewhere in that chaos, people were fighting for things they loved. His father, Sophie's mother, good people trying to protect innocent children from those who would hurt them. Mrs. Rodriguez, Danny said suddenly, we can't go to the police station. Why not, mijo? Because some of the bad men might be pretending to police, and because Sophie's mama is still out there fighting for her. If we disappear into the system, her mama might never find her. Mrs. Rodriguez glanced at Sophie in the rearview mirror. Is that what you want, Nina, to wait for your mama? Sophie nodded solemnly. She's coming for me. I know she is. Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then made a U-turn that surprised both children. Then we wait. But not here, and not at the police station. I know a place where you'll be safe until this is over. As they drove toward an uncertain but hopeful future, none of them noticed the black sedan that pulled out from a side road and began following them at a discreet distance. Carlyle had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to catch your prey was to let them lead you to exactly where you wanted to go. The hunt was far from over, but the players were finally beginning to reveal themselves, and in the mountains above, Isabella continued her desperate race against time, knowing that every second brought her either closer to her daughter or closer to losing her forever. The safe house Mrs. Rodriguez had chosen was her sister's farm tucked away in a valley where rolling hills provided natural cover from prying eyes. As they pulled up the gravel driveway, Danny could see why she'd thought it would be safe. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by fields and woods that would make it nearly impossible for strangers to approach undetected. Maria, Mrs. Rodriguez called out as they climbed the porch steps. I need your help. The woman who opened the door was older than Mrs. Rodriguez, with silver-streaked hair and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Her eyes widened when she saw the two bedraggled children, but she stepped aside without question. Bathrooms upstairs, second door on the right, Maria said simply. Hot water, clean towels, and I'll find some clothes that might fit. Danny had never appreciated the simple luxury of a hot shower until that moment. The warm water seemed to wash away hours of fear and cold, leaving him feeling almost human again. When he emerged from the bathroom, he found Sophie sitting on a bed, in clothes that were far too big for her, looking lost and vulnerable despite her brave attempts to seem grown up. "How are you holding up?" Danny asked, settling beside her on the bed. "I keep thinking about my mama," Sophie said quietly. "Those explosions we heard, what if she got hurt trying to help us?" Danny didn't have an answer for that. The possibility that Sophie's mother might have been injured or killed while creating a diversion for their escape was too terrible to contemplate, but it was also undeniably real. "Your mama sounds like she knows how to take care of herself," he said finally. "And my dad always says that love makes people stronger and smarter than they think they can be. You really miss him, don't you?" "Yeah." Danny's voice was thick with emotion. "I keep thinking about the last thing I said to him. I promised I'd take care of you, and I promised I'd be brave, but I don't feel brave. I feel scared all the time." Sophie studied his face with the solemn intensity that seemed to be her natural expression. "You know what I think. I think being scared but doing the right thing anyway is the bravest thing there is, and you've been taking care of me this whole time." Before Danny could respond, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway with steaming mugs of hot chocolate and worried news. "I called the police station," she said, settling into a chair beside the bed. "Your father was found unconscious in a warehouse about 2 hours ago. He's alive, but he's in the hospital." Danny's heart lurched between relief and terror. "Is he okay? Can I see him?" "He's stable, but the doctors want to keep him for observation. And mijo, there's something else the police want to talk to both of you. They say there are federal agents involved now asking questions about Sophie." Sophie went pale. "Federal agents work for my grandpa. He has people everywhere." Mrs. Rodriguez frowned. "What do you mean, Nina?" "My mama told me that Grandpa Howard has friends in the government, in the police, everywhere important people work. She said that's why we could never really be safe, because he could make anyone do what he wanted." Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. "So we can't trust the police." "Some we can trust," Mrs. Rodriguez said carefully. "But how do we know which ones?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications none of them wanted to face. If Howard Sinclair really did have the kind of connections Sophie described, then the very people they should turn to for help might be the ones who would hand them over to their enemies. "There's someone coming up the driveway," Maria called from downstairs, her voice tight with concern. Mrs. Rodriguez moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the approaching headlights. "One car moving slowly. Could be police, could be." She trailed off as the vehicle came into clearer view. "We need to hide," Sophie said urgently. "Right now." Danny trusted her instincts completely by now. They'd kept her alive through days of running and hiding, and he wasn't about to second-guess them. "Where?" Maria appeared in the doorway, moving with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis. "Root cellar behind the kitchen. It's hidden under a rug, and there's another way out through the storm doors if you need it." They followed her downstairs, Sophie clinging to Danny's hand as they made their way through the darkened house. The root cellar was cramped and smelled of earth and preserved vegetables, but it was completely hidden from casual view. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered as she lowered the trap door above them. In the darkness below, Danny and Sophie pressed close together, listening to the sounds of the house above. Footsteps on the porch, the knock at the front door, muffled voices that seemed to go on forever. "Mrs. Elena Rodriguez." The voice was cultured, professional, and somehow familiar. "Yes, that's me." "I'm Agent Carlisle, FBI. We're looking for 2 children who may be in danger. We have reason to believe they might have contacted you." Danny felt Sophie's sharp intake of breath beside him. Agent Carlisle, but that was the same name as the man who had hurt his father. The pieces clicked together in Danny's mind with sickening clarity. The kidnappers weren't just pretending to be law enforcement. They actually were law enforcement, or at least some of them were. "I haven't seen any children," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice steady, despite what must have been tremendous fear. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand your desire to protect them, but these children are in very real danger. The girl has been kidnapped, and the boy may have been traumatized by witnessing violence. They need professional help. Like I said, I haven't seen them." There was a pause, and Danny could imagine Carlyle studying Mrs. Rodriguez's face, looking for tells that might reveal the lie. "Mrs. Rodriguez, interfering with a federal investigation is a serious crime. If you're harboring these children, you could face charges of obstruction of justice, aiding and abetting, possibly even kidnapping." "Are you threatening me, Agent Carlyle?" "I'm explaining the legal consequences of your actions. These children belong with their families, not hiding in fear because of misguided good intentions." Sophie's fingers dug into Danny's arm. She was shaking, whether from cold or terror he couldn't tell. Danny wrapped his arms around her, trying to offer what comfort he could in the suffocating darkness of their hiding place. "I think you should leave." Maria's voice cut through the tension above. "My sister told you she hasn't seen any children, and unless you have a warrant, you have no business being here. And you are Maria Santos. This is my property, and you're not welcome on it." Danny heard the sound of several more car doors slamming outside. Carlyle hadn't come alone, and whatever patience he'd been showing was apparently at an end. "Mrs. Rodriguez, Mrs. Santos, I'm going to give you one last opportunity to cooperate. Tell us where the children are, and we can all walk away from this peacefully." "There are no children here," Mrs. Rodriguez repeated, but Danny could hear the strain in her voice. "Search the house." The sounds that followed made Danny's blood run cold. Heavy footsteps moving through the rooms above, furniture being overturned, doors being yanked open. The searchers were thorough and professional, and it was only a matter of time before they found the root cellar. "Danny," Sophie whispered so quietly he could barely hear her. "There's another way out. Through the storm doors, remember." Danny nodded, feeling blindly in the darkness, until his hands found the outline of the exterior door that led up to the backyard. The handle turned, but the door was heavy and squeaked ominously as he pushed it open. They emerged into the night air just as flashlight beams began probing the main floor of the house. Moving as quietly as possible, Danny and Sophie crept away from the farmhouse, using the barn and outbuildings as cover. "Where do we go now?" Sophie asked, her voice small and lost. Danny looked back at the house where Mrs. Rodriguez and her sister were facing down federal agents who were anything but federal, anything but just. Two more innocent people who were suffering because they'd tried to help. The guilt was overwhelming, but Danny pushed it aside. They could feel guilty later after they were safe. "The woods," he said. "We hide in the woods until morning, then figure out our next move." They made it perhaps 100 yards before the dogs found their scent. The baying of the hounds cut through the night like a siren, sending both children into an immediate panic. Danny had watched enough movies to know that running from tracking dogs was usually futile, but he also knew they had no choice. "Run!" he gasped, grabbing Sophie's hand and pulling her deeper into the forest. Behind them, shouts erupted from the farmhouse. Flashlight beams began sweeping the tree line, and the sound of men coordinating a search operation carried clearly through the still air. "There's no point in running," Carlyle's voice boomed through a megaphone. "We have thermal imaging equipment and trained tracking dogs. You cannot escape. Come out now, and no one else has to get hurt." The implied threat sent a chill through Danny's bones. Mrs. Rodriguez and Maria were still in that house, still at the mercy of men who had no mercy to give. But if he and Sophie surrendered, it would all be for nothing. They ran through the forest branches, tearing at their clothes and roots, threatening to trip them with every step. Sophie was breathing hard, her shorter legs struggling to keep up with Danny's pace, but she never complained, never asked him to slow down. The dogs were getting closer. Danny could hear them crashing through the underbrush, their handlers shouting encouragement and directions. At this rate, they'd be caught within minutes. "Danny, stop!" Sophie's voice was urgent but not panicked. "Listen." Danny paused, straining his ears over the sound of his own labored breathing. At first he heard only the dogs and their handlers, but then he caught it, the sound of running water somewhere ahead. "A river," Sophie said. "Dogs can't track across running water." It was their only chance. Danny led them toward the sound, praying that the water would be shallow enough to cross, but deep enough to break their scent trail. The forest seemed to go on forever, every tree looking like every other tree in the darkness, but the sound of water grew steadily louder. They burst from the tree line onto the rocky bank of a mountain stream swollen with storm runoff. The water was moving fast and looked deeper than Danny had hoped, but the baying of the hounds was getting closer with every second. "We have to try," he said, wading into the current. The water was shockingly cold, stealing his breath and numbing his legs almost instantly. Sophie gasped as she followed him in the current, immediately trying to sweep her downstream. Danny grabbed her hand, fighting to maintain his footing on the slippery rocks. "Stay together," he called over the rush of water. "Don't let go of my hand." They struggled across the stream, the water rising to Sophie's chest and threatening to knock them both off their feet. Halfway across, Danny lost his footing and went under the current, dragging both of them downstream before he managed to regain his balance. By the time they hauled themselves out on the far bank, they were both hypothermic and exhausted. But behind them, the sound of the dogs had grown confused, uncertain. The water had broken their scent trail, at least temporarily. "We did it," Sophie gasped, her teeth chattering violently. "For now," Danny replied, helping her to her feet. "But they'll figure out where we crossed eventually. We need to find shelter and get warm." They stumbled away from the stream, deeper into the forest on the far side. Danny's legs felt like rubber, and Sophie was weaving with exhaustion, but they forced themselves to keep moving. Behind them, they could hear Carlisle's men reaching the stream, the dogs whining in confusion as the scent trail disappeared. "Bring up the thermal imaging," Carlisle's voice carried across the water. "They can't have gone far." Danny's heart sank. Thermal imaging would show their body heat even through the forest canopy. They needed to find shelter that would mask their heat signature, and they needed to find it fast. That's when he saw the old mine shaft. It was little more than a hole in the hillside, overgrown with vegetation and partially collapsed from decades of neglect. But it was shelter, and the stone walls would block thermal imaging. "In here," Danny whispered, leading Sophie toward the entrance. The mine shaft was pitch black and smelled of dampness and decay, but it was warm compared to the mountain air. They crawled as far back as they dared, until the entrance was just a faint gray smudge in the distance. "Danny," Sophie whispered, "I'm really scared." "Me too," he admitted. "But we're safe for now. They won't find us in here." They huddled together in the darkness, sharing what little body heat they had left. Outside, they could hear the search continuing, voices calling to each other, the whir of helicopter rotors in the distance, the occasional bark of a confused dog. "Danny," Sophie said, after a long silence, "do you think our parents are looking for us too?" "I know they are," Danny replied with absolute certainty. "My dad won't give up until he finds me. And your mama won't give up until she finds you, even if the bad men are stronger. Especially then, parents don't give up on their kids no matter what. Meanwhile, in a hospital bed across town, Michael Carter was proving Danny's faith justified. Despite a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and enough painkillers to fell a horse, he was already planning his escape from medical custody. "Mr. Carter, you need to rest," the nurse said for the 4th time in an hour. "Your body has been through severe trauma." "My son is missing," Michael replied, just as he had the previous 3 times. "I'm not resting until I find him." The police are compromised." Michael's voice was flat, certain. "Some of the men who attacked me claimed to be federal agents. How do I know the cops aren't working with them?" The nurse looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Carter, you're talking about a very serious conspiracy theory." "It's not a theory when you've lived through it." Michael had been thinking clearly for the past hour, ever since the painkillers had worn off enough for him to process what had happened. Carlyle and his men had been too organized, too professional, too confident in their authority to be simple criminals. They'd moved with the assurance of people who believed they were above the law, which meant they either were law enforcement or had law enforcement backing. Either way, Danny was in more danger than anyone realized. "I need to make a phone call," Michael said, reaching for the bedside phone. "Mr. Carter, it's 3 in the morning. This can't wait." Michael dialed Elena Rodriguez's number, knowing she was probably the only person besides himself who truly understood what Danny was facing. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. That's when Michael knew something was very wrong. Elena never let her phone go to voicemail, not when she knew children might be in danger. He tried her sister's number with the same result. Then her daughter's phone, her son-in-law's, every contact he could think of. Nothing. Michael looked at the IV line in his arm, at the monitors tracking his vital signs, at the nurse who was watching him with growing concern. Then he made a decision that would have horrified his doctors, but would have made his son proud. He ripped the IV from his arm and swung his legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the wave of dizziness that threatened to knock him down. "Mr. Carter, you can't leave. You're not medically cleared. Then clear me." "I can't do that. You need at least another 12 hours of observation." "My son doesn't have 12 hours. Michael stood up, fighting through the pain and vertigo. His clothes were in the bedside closet, wrinkled and blood-stained but serviceable. He began pulling them on with mechanical determination. "I'm calling security," the nurse warned. "Call whoever you want," Michael replied, lacing up his boots. "Just know that when my son dies because I was stuck in this hospital bed, I'm holding everyone who kept me here personally responsible." The nurse hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the desperate sincerity in Michael's voice. "Mr. Carter, please. The police are either incompetent or corrupt, and either way, they're not going to save my boy." Michael finished dressing and headed for the door. "I am." He made it to the parking garage before the dizziness forced him to stop and lean against a concrete pillar. His vision was swimming, and every breath sent spikes of pain through his damaged ribs. But Danny was out there somewhere, probably cold and scared and running for his life. Michael straightened up and kept walking. The motorcycle he chose was a sleek Japanese sport bike that would have been impossible to steal under normal circumstances. But Michael's desperate state had sharpened his focus to a laser point, and his locksmith skills learned during a rebellious youth he rarely talked about came back like muscle memory. As he rode through the pre-dawn streets toward Elena's sister's farm, Michael tried to prepare himself for what he might find. If Carlyle's people had tracked Danny to the Rodriguez family, then innocent people were probably already hurt. The guilt would have been overwhelming if Michael had allowed himself to feel it, but he'd locked that part of himself away for now. He could feel guilty later after Danny was safe. The farm looked peaceful from the road, But Michael's trained eye picked up the details that told a different story. Tire tracks in the mud from vehicles that were too expensive for farm use, subtle damage to the front door that suggested forced entry, and most telling of all, the complete absence of lights or movement, despite the fact that Maria Santos was an early riser who should have been starting her morning chores. Michael parked the motorcycle a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, moving with the stealth he'd learned during his brief stint in the military. The front door was unlocked, which was never a good sign in rural areas where people were cautious about security. Inside the house showed clear signs of a search. Furniture had been moved, drawers opened, cushions displaced. But there was no sign of violence, no blood, no indication that anyone had been seriously hurt. Michael found Elena and Maria in the kitchen, zip-tied to chairs, but otherwise unharmed. Both women looked up with relief when he appeared in the doorway. "Michael," Elena gasped. "Thank God you're all right." "Where are the kids?" Michael asked, cutting their restraints with a kitchen knife. "Gone," Maria replied, rubbing circulation back into her wrists. "They hid in the root cellar when the agents came, but they must have escaped when the house was being searched." "How long ago?" 3 hours, maybe 4. The agents left about an hour ago, said they were expanding the search to the surrounding area. Michael's heart sank. Danny and Sophie had been running through the mountains for hours in near-freezing temperatures. Even if they'd found shelter, hypothermia would be setting in by now. "Did they say anything about where they were going?" he asked. Elena shook her head. "But Michael, there's something else. One of the agents called another one Carlisle, and I heard them talking about thermal imaging and tracking dogs." "Dogs?" Michael's blood turned to ice. "They're hunting them with dogs." "We called the real police," Maria said quickly, "but they said federal agents had already been in touch, that the situation was being handled at a higher level." "The fix is in," Michael said grimly. "We're on our own." He moved to the window, studying the landscape in the growing dawn light. If Danny had run into the mountains, there were dozens of places he could hide: caves, abandoned buildings, old mine shafts. But thermal imaging would eventually find them, and tracking dogs would make it impossible to stay mobile. Unless... Michael turned back to the two women. "Elena, does your nephew still work for the Forest Service?" "Miguel, yes, but call him. Tell him we need to use the old fire tower on Granite Peak, and tell him to bring everything he has for cold weather survival." "Michael, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if Carlisle wants to hunt my son like an animal, then it's time someone started hunting him back." As Michael prepared for what might be the most important mission of his life, 20 miles away in the depths of an abandoned mine shaft, Danny Carter was learning that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you were afraid. "I don't think I can do this much longer," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "You don't have to," Danny replied, pulling her closer. "Because I just figured out what we're going to do." "What?" "We're going to stop running." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "You mean give up?" "No," Danny said, his young voice carrying a determination that would have made his father proud. "I mean, we're going to fight back." The game of cat and mouse was about to become something much more dangerous, and the children who had been running for their lives were about to discover that sometimes the best defense was a good offense. In the cold darkness of the mineshaft, Danny's declaration hung in the air like a challenge to fate itself. Sophie shifted beside him, her small body tense with a mixture of hope and fear. "How do we fight back?" she whispered. "We're just kids." "Maybe that's exactly why we can win," Danny replied, his voice gaining strength as the idea crystallized in his mind. "They're expecting us to keep running, to keep hiding. They're not expecting us to turn around and come for them." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing this radical shift in strategy. "What did you have in mind?" Danny had been thinking about this ever since they'd entered the mine shaft. The men hunting them were professionals with resources and technology that two children couldn't hope to match in a straight fight. But they also had weaknesses, arrogance, predictability, and most importantly, they underestimated their prey. "They think they know us," Danny said. "They think I'm just a scared little boy and you're just a helpless victim. But they don't know that you escaped from them once already, and they don't know that my dad taught me things." "What kind of things?" "Survival things. How to read people, how to spot danger, how to make weapons from ordinary stuff." Danny's voice carried a pride that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He said, "You never know when you might need to protect yourself or someone you care about." Sophie felt a warmth spread through her chest, not just from Danny's body heat, but from the realization that someone cared enough about her to risk everything. "So what's the plan?" "We make them come to us. On our terms, in a place we choose." As dawn broke over the mountains, casting long shadows through the forest, Danny began to outline a plan that was equal parts desperate and brilliant. It relied on their intimate knowledge of the terrain, their ability to move unseen, and most importantly, their willingness to risk everything for each other. Meanwhile, Michael Carter was putting his own plan into motion. The fire tower on Granite Peak offered a commanding view of the entire search area, and Elena's nephew Miguel had come through with cold weather gear and a detailed topographical map of the region. "The dogs lost their scent at Bear Creek," Miguel reported, pointing to a spot on the map. "But there are thermal imaging helicopters covering the area in grids. If the kids are still out there, they'll be found eventually." Michael studied the map, his eyes tracing possible escape routes and hiding places. Unless they're somewhere the thermal imaging can't penetrate. "Like where?" "Underground. Old mine shafts, natural caves, anything with enough rock between them and the surface." Miguel nodded slowly. "There are 3 abandoned mines in that area: Copper Creek Silver Dollar and the old Granite Works shaft." "How do we reach them without being spotted?" "There's an old logging road that connects all 3 sites. It's overgrown now, barely passable, but a motorcycle could make it." Michael was already moving toward his stolen bike. "Show me." As they descended from the fire tower, neither man noticed the black helicopter that banked sharply and began following their progress at a discreet distance. Carlisle's people had been monitoring all radio communications in the area, and Elena's call to Miguel had been intercepted and analyzed. The hunter was about to become the hunted. In the Granite Works mineshaft, Danny and Sophie were making final preparations for what Danny privately thought of as their last stand. They'd spent the morning gathering materials, loose rocks, rusty mining equipment, anything that could serve as a weapon or obstacle. "Remember," Danny said, as they worked, "the idea isn't to hurt them, it's to scare them, confuse them, make them think we're more dangerous than we really are." "And then what?" "Then we run like hell and hope my dad finds us before they do." Sophie paused in her rock gathering. "Danny, what if this doesn't work? What if they catch us anyway?" Danny met her eyes, seeing his own fear reflected there, but also something else, a determination that reminded him of his father's expression when things got tough. "Then at least we'll go down fighting. At least we won't make it easy for them." "Your dad would be proud of you," Sophie said quietly. "Yours too." They finished their preparations, just as the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the forest. Danny's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized that their desperate gamble was about to be put to the test. "Remember the signal," he whispered as they took their positions deeper in the mine shaft. "When I shout now, we spring everything at once." Sophie nodded, her face pale but resolute in the dim light filtering through the mine entrance. Danny, yeah, thank you for protecting me, for not giving up for everything. Thank you for trusting me. The voices outside were getting closer. Professional, coordinated, but with an undertone of frustration that suggested the long night of searching had frayed even these men's patience. Thermal imaging shows 2 heat signatures in the mine shaft, someone reported. Confirmed juvenile size. Finally, Carlyle's voice was sharp with satisfaction. Deploy gas grenades. I want them unconscious, not dead. Mr. Sinclair's orders were very specific about the girl's condition. Danny's blood ran cold. Gas grenades would render their entire plan useless, turning their carefully prepared ambush into a death trap. But as he watched the tactical team approach the mine entrance, he realized they'd made one crucial mistake. They were bunching up at the entrance instead of spreading out to cover multiple angles. Now! Danny shouted. The avalanche they'd rigged came down like the wrath of God, tons of loose rock and debris cascading from the mine ceiling to seal the entrance completely. The tactical team scattered, shouting warnings and diving for cover, as dust and stone filled the air. But Danny and Sophie weren't at the cave-in site. They were 50 feet deeper in the mine, where a secondary shaft led to an exit that the tactical team's maps didn't show. Move. Danny grabbed Sophie's hand and led her through the narrow passage, their flashlight beam dancing wildly as they ran. Behind them, they could hear Carlyle's voice raised in fury. Get that entrance cleared. I want demolition charges. I want excavation equipment. I want those children found. Sir, it could take hours to clear that much debris safely. Then we don't do it safely. Those children are not escaping again. But Danny and Sophie were already emerging from the hidden exit on the far side of the hill, gasping in the clean mountain air and reveling in their temporary victory. They'd bought themselves time, but they both knew it was only temporary. Which way now? Sophie asked. Down, Danny replied, pointing toward the valley floor, where a ribbon of road wound between the trees. We need to reach that road and find help before they figure out where we went. They scrambled down the hillside using trees and boulders for cover as helicopter rotors whined overhead. The thermal imaging would pick them up again soon, but for now they were hidden under the forest canopy. That's when Danny heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distinctive rumble of his father's stolen motorcycle. Dad! Danny shouted, waving frantically as the bike came into view on the road below. Michael spotted them immediately, his heart nearly stopping with relief at the sight of his son alive and unharmed. He gunned the engine up the steep slope, reaching them just as the helicopter swung around for another pass. Danny! Michael swept his son into a fierce hug, not caring about his damaged ribs or the tears streaming down both their faces. God, I thought I'd lost you. Dad, this is Sophie. She's the one the bad men are trying to take. Michael looked at the little girl who had cost his son so much pain and nearly cost Danny his life, and saw only a frightened child who needed protection. Hello, Sophie. Your mother is looking for you. She is. Sophie's eyes lit up with desperate hope. She is, and we're going to get you back to her. Michael lifted both children onto the motorcycle, knowing that the bike wasn't designed for 3 passengers, but having no choice. But first, we need to get out of here. The helicopter was banking around for another approach, and Michael could see armed figures rappelling down ropes toward their position. He kicked the bike into gear and shot down the hillside, weaving between trees as gunfire erupted behind them. Hold tight, Michael shouted over the engine noise. They burst onto the main road, just as black SUVs converged from both directions, their occupants already bringing weapons to bear. Michael had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether his son lived or died. He chose the most insane option available. Instead of trying to outrun the SUVs, Michael gunned the motorcycle straight at the nearest one, playing a deadly game of chicken with professionals who were paid to never blink first. At the last possible second, the SUV's driver lost his nerve and swerved aside. Michael shot through the gap between vehicles, the bike's engine screaming as he pushed it beyond its design limits. "Dad, there's more coming!" Danny shouted, pointing ahead to where another roadblock was forming. But Michael had spotted something else, a dirt access road that led up to a fire tower on the next ridge. If they could reach high ground, they might be able to signal for help from the real authorities. The motorcycle clawed its way up the steep trail, dirt and gravel spraying from its tires as Michael fought to maintain control. Behind them, the SUVs had given up the chase. Their low-slung vehicles couldn't handle the rough terrain. But the helicopter was another story. The aircraft swept overhead like a mechanical vulture, its downdraft threatening to knock them off the narrow trail. Michael could see the sniper in the open doorway, his rifle trained on the motorcycle's occupants. "This is your last warning," Carlisle's voice boomed from the helicopter's loudspeaker. "Stop the vehicle and surrender the children, or we will be forced to take more direct action." Michael's response was to gun the engine harder, coaxing every last ounce of power from the aging machine. The fire tower was just ahead, its steel framework reaching toward the sky like a beacon of hope. They made it to the base of the tower, just as the sniper's rifle cracked like thunder. The bullet sparked off the motorcycle's frame inches from Danny's head, and Michael knew their luck had finally run out. "Up the tower," he shouted, pushing both children toward the steel ladder. "Climb as fast as you can." "What about you?" Danny asked. "I'll be right behind you. Go." Michael waited until both children were 20 feet up the ladder before following his damaged ribs, screaming in protest with every rung. Below, he could see more vehicles converging on their position. Carlisle wasn't taking any chances this time. They reached the observation platform just as the helicopter moved in for the kill shot. Michael pushed Danny and Sophie behind the tower's metal framework, using the steel beams as cover against the sniper's rifle. "Nowhere left to run, Mr. Carter," Carlisle's voice echoed across the platform. "Send down the children and you can walk away from this." "Go to hell," Michael replied, though he knew their situation was hopeless. They were trapped on a platform 60 feet in the air with professional killers below and a sniper above. That's when the miracle happened. The sound came from the south, another helicopter, but this one marked with the distinctive colors of the FBI. Not Carlisle's fake federal agents, but the real thing. "This is Agent Sarah Chen, FBI," a voice crackled over the radio. "All aircraft in this area are ordered to land immediately. This airspace is now under federal jurisdiction." Carlisle's helicopter hesitated, hovering uncertainly as its pilot processed this new development. "I repeat, land your aircraft immediately, or you will be fired upon." "Sir," the pilot's voice was tight with concern. "They've got military backup incoming. I'm reading 4 more aircraft approaching from the east." Michael could see them now, a formation of military helicopters approaching at high speed, their weapon systems clearly visible, even from a distance. Carlisle's voice crackled over the radio, furious but defeated. "This isn't over, Carter. Howard Sinclair has resources you can't imagine." "I have something he doesn't," Michael replied into his stolen radio. "I have the truth." The standoff on the fire tower lasted another 20 minutes, as federal agents surrounded the area and began the delicate process of sorting out who was who in the complex web of corruption and violence. But for Michael, Danny, and Sophie, the real moment of victory came when they saw a familiar figure climbing the tower's ladder with the determined grace of a woman who had moved heaven and earth to reach this moment. "Mama!" Sophie's cry of joy echoed across the mountain as Isabella Sinclair appeared on the observation platform. The reunion between mother and daughter was everything Michael had hoped. His own reunion with Danny would be fierce, tearful, and absolutely unconditional. Isabella swept Sophie into her arms, as if she would never let her go again, and for a moment all the violence and terror of the past few days seemed to fade away. "I knew you'd come," Sophie whispered against her mother's neck. "I knew you wouldn't give up." "Never," Isabella replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I will never give up on you." As federal agents began the process of arresting Carlisle's team and securing the scene, Isabella turned to Michael with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You risked everything for a child you didn't even know." "Any parent would have done the same thing," Michael replied, but Isabella shook her head. "No, they wouldn't. Most people would have called the police and walked away. You chose to get involved to put yourself and your son in danger for a stranger. That's not normal, that's heroic." Danny was listening to this exchange with the wide-eyed attention of a child trying to understand the adult world. "Dad, what's going to happen to Sophie now? Will the bad men come back?" Isabella's expression hardened. "Not if I have anything to say about it." And the legal battle that followed made national headlines. Howard Sinclair, one of the most powerful men in America, found himself facing federal charges of conspiracy, kidnapping, and corruption. The evidence Isabella had been gathering for years, combined with testimony from Michael and the children, painted a picture of a man who had used his wealth and connections to place himself above the law. But perhaps more damaging than the criminal charges was the public revelation of what Howard Sinclair was really like, a man who would terrorize his own granddaughter and innocent families in pursuit of his obsession with control and legacy. The trial lasted 6 months. Michael testified about the attack on his garage, the torture he'd endured, and the manhunt that had endangered 2 innocent children. Danny, despite his age, was deemed competent to testify about his experiences, and his simple, honest account of trying to protect Sophie moved the jury to tears. But it was Sophie's testimony that sealed Howard Sinclair's fate. The little girl who had shown such courage in the mountains displayed the same bravery in the courtroom, describing in her own words what it was like to live in fear of a grandfather who saw her not as a beloved grandchild, but as a possession to be controlled. "He wanted to make me like him," Sophie told the court, her small voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "But Mama taught me that love is stronger than fear, and being kind is better than being powerful." Howard Sinclair was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. At 72 years old, it was effectively a life sentence, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. But for Michael, Danny, and Sophie, the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the life they built together in the months that followed. Isabella had been serious about her promise to disappear with Sophie, but instead of running to some distant country, she chose to rebuild their lives in Havenport. She bought a house near the coast where Sophie could hear the ocean from her bedroom window and never feel trapped again. Michael's garage, which had been destroyed in the raid, was rebuilt with Isabella's help. But this time, it was more than just a struggling repair shop. It became a community gathering place where neighbors knew they could bring their problems, mechanical or otherwise, and find help without judgment. "Dad," Danny said one evening, as they worked together on a particularly stubborn transmission, "do you think Sophie's grandpa will ever get out of prison?" Michael paused in his work, considering how to answer. "I don't know, buddy. But I know that even if he does, he can't hurt Sophie anymore. She's got too many people protecting her now." It was true. The ordeal had created bonds that went far beyond the original participants. Elena Rodriguez had become like a grandmother to Sophie, teaching her to cook traditional recipes and telling her stories about brave women who had faced impossible odds. Maria Santos had offered her farm as a refuge anytime Sophie needed to escape the pressures of her unusual life. But perhaps the strongest bond was between Danny and Sophie themselves. The shared trauma and triumph had forged a connection that transcended their age difference and different backgrounds. Danny had appointed himself Sophie's permanent protector, while Sophie had become the little sister Danny had never known he wanted. "Danny," Sophie said one afternoon as they played in the tide pools near Isabella's house, "do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found each other that night?" Danny considered this watching a hermit crab scuttle across the rocks. "I think we would have found each other anyway somehow. Some things are just meant to be. Like family. Yeah, like family." Isabella, watching from the porch as the two children explored the rocky shore, felt a peace she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she was free from her father's control and from the fear that had shaped her decisions for so long, free to be the mother Sophie deserved. Michael joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into the chair beside hers. Their relationship had evolved slowly over the months, built on shared experience and mutual respect rather than romance or passion. But it was solid in a way that neither of them had ever experienced before. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked, following her gaze to where Danny and Sophie were building an elaborate sandcastle. "I'm thinking about second chances," Isabella replied. "How rare they are, and how lucky we are to get them. Any regrets?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret that other people got hurt because of my family's dysfunction. I regret that you and Danny had to go through what you did. But I can't regret the outcome." "Why not?" "Because this," she gestured toward the children, toward the peaceful scene spread out before them. "This is what love looks like when it's not corrupted by power or control or fear. This is what I always wanted for Sophie, but never believed was possible." Michael understood. His own childhood had been marked by uncertainty and struggle, and he'd spent years wondering if he was doing right by Danny. But watching his son now confident, compassionate, brave in the way that mattered, Michael knew that all the hardships had been worth it. "So what happens next?" he asked. "Next we live," Isabella said simply. "We wake up each morning grateful for what we have, instead of afraid of what we might lose. We raise our children to be kind and strong and brave. We build something beautiful from all the broken pieces." As the sun set over the Pacific painting, the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the 4 people on the beach began to gather their things and head home. They moved together naturally, like a family that had been together for years rather than months. Danny helping Sophie carry her collection of shells, Michael and Isabella walking side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, but their connection deeper than physical contact. They were an unlikely family, forged by crisis, but sustained by choice. A struggling mechanic and his brave son. A billionaire heiress who had learned that wealth meant nothing without love. A little girl who had faced her worst fears and emerged stronger. They had all lost things in the storm that had brought them together. Innocent security, the illusion that the world was a safe and predictable place. But they had gained something more valuable. The knowledge that love really was stronger than fear, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the stakes were high enough, and that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who would walk through fire for you and never ask for anything in return. As they reached the house, Sophie turned back for one last look at the ocean. "Mama," she said, "do you think there are other families out there who need help like we did?" Isabella knelt down to her daughter's eye level. "Probably. Why? Maybe we could help them. Like Danny's dad helped us? Isabella smiled, seeing in her daughter's suggestion the seeds of something that could grow into a lifetime of purpose. Maybe we could. Would you like that? I think so. I think that's what people are supposed to do, help each other. Michael overheard this exchange and felt something shift in his chest, not just pride in the children's compassion, but a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced in years. Maybe their story didn't have to end with their own happiness. Maybe it could be the beginning of something larger. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, a ritual that had become sacred to all of them, Danny raised his glass of milk in a toast. To family, he said solemnly. To family. The others echoed, and in that simple moment, 4 people who had once been strangers sealed a bond that would last the rest of their lives. Outside, the storm that had brought them together had long since passed, leaving behind clear skies and calm seas. But inside the house by the ocean, the warmth they had created together would weather any storm that might come their way. Because they had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, real love, doesn't make you weak, it makes you invincible. And in a world that often seemed dark and dangerous, that was the most revolutionary truth of all.